meditation teacher, a spiritual guide, a mystical philosopher. I've written books, I've taught programs, I've led retreats. And if you are not familiar with my work, you won't know that during that time I've undergone several changes. And right now I'm in the middle of what I see as the next big change in myself, in my spiritual life, and in my work. I'm calling it a mythopoetic awakening. And I want to explain that to you, but I want to start by going back and speaking a little bit about how I got here. So for 20 years, I lived in a spiritual community. I lived in a spiritual community with a teacher named Andrew Cohen. It was a very vibrant community, a very active community. We did an enormous amount of practice. I became my teacher's personal assistant. And also, I started teaching there. I started teaching in earnest in 2005. And I taught all over the US, many places throughout the world. And what I was teaching at that time was my teacher's teaching. He called it evolutionary enlightenment, and that's what I was teaching. It was all about the recognition that human consciousness, the consciousness that I have, is the consciousness of the cosmos. In fact, it's the evolutionary edge of the consciousness of the cosmos. And I was very inspired by that teaching. I was living that teaching, and I was teaching that teaching. Now, in 2012, the community that I was living in collapsed for a lot of reasons. And like many stories of that type, it's a messy story. And it's beyond the scope of this video. But it ended. And when I left, I was very uncertain about teaching at all, but I certainly didn't want to teach what I had been teaching before. And what felt most authentic to me was to teach meditation, because meditation was the spiritual practice that had been most transformative for me. So my first book was called The Miracle of Meditation. It's a book about the practice of meditation. I called that practice the practice of no problem. Sometime later, I called it the art of conscious contentment, but it's simply a practice of sitting and letting everything be. It's the way I had been taught to meditate. It's what transformed me so fundamentally. And so that's what I started to teach. I wrote more books about meditation, including this one, The Experience of Luminous Absorption. And people were really responding to that meditation. But after a few years of teaching meditation, I started to think more philosophically about what it meant, not just to do meditation and garner experiences through meditation, but what does it mean to transform? How do we really change? And at that point, I really started to get fascinated by the idea of paradigm shifting. What is a paradigm? What's the set of assumptions that we live inside of that shapes our reality, shapes our perceptions? And how can we shift that so that we actually change the perception of reality we live in? And I wrote this book called Paradigm Shifting, among others, which really explored how that kind of change takes place, what a paradigm is, and how we can shift the paradigm that we live in and unlock potentials that aren't available in the current paradigm. And as I thought about that, I did 3 years worth of programs devoted to paradigm shifting. I read an enormous amount about ideas, paradigm shifting ideas. And as that moved on, I at some point recognized that my own deepest spiritual realization was a realization of what's traditionally called, or has been called, cosmic consciousness. I had that experience first when I was quite young. I had a reawakening of it at the age of 29 in my previous community, in the community that I was living in. That experience is the driver of my spiritual life. It's what I feel I was born to share. It's what I feel I can't talk enough about. And so at that point, I really started to speak more directly about cosmic consciousness, about my experience of cosmic consciousness. I wrote this book, The Path of Cosmic Consciousness, for that reason. More recently, I've just published this book. It's called Embody Your Cosmic Self, also in the same vein. And so cosmic consciousness really became the focus of my energy and attention. Along with that, I started to become very, very fascinated by the idea of the soul, by the idea that there is a part of us that was here before this birth and will continue on after death. That this one lifetime, this one physical existence is not the limit of who I am. And that started to become very important to me because I began to realize that we're all on our unique path. Our soul is dictating, is creating the path that we need. We were born for a purpose. We were born spiritually for a purpose. And our soul's purpose is what our spiritual life needs to be dedicated to. That means the experience of awakening that I had and the practices that work for me may or may not work for you. You may not be on the same path. We may be, and probably are, quite close. We're probably traveling quite closely together. But in the end, our paths will have to diverge at some point because we all have a unique destination. So I really started to think about, read about, contemplate, meditate on the soul's journey. And then I wrote a book called The Soul's Journey to Wholeness because I wanted to start to articulate how the soul develops, what the soul is, what the reality of existence is prior to birth, beyond death. And that consumed me for a time. And then at one point, I wanted to start to pull all this together. I wanted to create a single expression, articulation of the path of awakening that I've been living basically for my entire adult life. And I put it all in this book. It's called Transdimensional Spirituality. And essentially, it's a path that involves a movement to oneness, to cosmic consciousness, to the ultimate consciousness, an exploration of higher, subtle realms of soul existence and development there, and finally, a return to the earth, a return to our life as an expression of higher possibilities. And so that was the path that I articulated. It was a path which involved an ascent into oneness, into cosmic consciousness, an exploration of higher realms of spirit, and then a return to earth as what I call an artist of possibility. Now, along with all that, I've been writing fiction for about the past 10 years. And that has, until recently, really been something I've held as kind of a hobby. And I've written books like Transdimensional Awakening, I, Cosmos, and my most recent, soon-to-be published novel, Transdimensional Time Travel. With this mythopoetic awakening that I am wanting to share with you, I'm beginning to realize that the whole spiritual path is not so much a path about practices that bring us closer and closer and more deeply into reality, although that's also true. But I think even more than that, it becomes an articulation of reality that we participate in. We don't just make it up, but what's becoming more and more clear to me is that reality isn't just something that exists separate from me over there that I'm discovering. It's not like something that exists in the dark and then I'm bringing a flashlight to find it. Reality is a story that I co-create with unseen forces, with unseen entities, with unseen influences. I am articulating the story of my reality, of my awakening process. I am articulating the story of who I am, what I'm capable of, where I'm going, and how to get there. Now, it's not just that I'm making this up like a fictional novel, but it kind of is. And when people say to me, well, you can't just make up reality. Reality is what's real. Reality is that which is objectively there, that more than one person can experience. And you can't just make that up. And then I would say, but who made up that story? Who made up that definition of reality? And why is that the one that we believe in? And people will say, well, that's how we experience it. And I would say, but that's how paradigms work. A paradigm tells you the way reality is. It convinces as many people as possible to live that way. And then it shapes your perception to garner evidence for that. But the reality is, the truth is, as we change the stories we live in, we start to accumulate different evidence that supports the story we're in. And so I'm in the middle of this realization that all through my spiritual path, from the beginning, moving into a spiritual community, through all the turns that I described to you in the books that I'm reading, I've been articulating my own path of awakening. And I'm aware that that's what others are doing. Even the people that work with me, sure, they are borrowing from my articulation, using it to the extent that they find valuable, but they're also creating their own story. And as I expand into this more mythopoetic view of the path, I want to encourage people on their spiritual journey to take more and more responsibility, creative responsibility, for writing the narrative of their spiritual awakening. And so that's what this is about. And I am now seeing that the reason I was so fascinated by novels, one of the reasons, is because somewhere inside, unconsciously, I knew that my spiritual awakening was a story that I was co-creating. I was co-authoring it with forces beyond. And somehow my fictional novels allowed me to explore the potential of narration. And they became and are today representations of not only what I teach and how it can be encoded into story, but they are representations of how deeper realities, deeper possibilities can reveal themselves through the process of writing. And that's something I want to explore more and more. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting, and I sincerely hope that it relates positively to your own path and gives you some avenues for further exploration that maybe you didn't have before. Thank you very much.